It's a story that caught the world's attention, the death of George Floyd in police custody, followed by global protests against racism, and the countless other black people who have died from police brutality. But as the story became front-page news, and major media companies rallied to cover it, one criticism kept being raised by readers: unconscious bias in reporting. On Twitter, some users pointed out how they thought this New York Times post was using a passive voice that downplayed police aggression and an active voice that highlighted protester violence. ABC 7 Chicago News was criticised for this clip where they blurred the faces of white counter-protesters, but not the faces of black protesters. And in the UK, Sky News was called out for its use of these photos in one article, where pictures of white protesters were used when depicting a peaceful protest, but photos of black protesters were used when depicting a riot. When approached for comment, the New York Times said the grammar of that one tweet does not reflect an overall tendency, and that numerous journalists used direct language that was impossible to misinterpret. Sky News told us that the photos did not appear next to each other, but the article was amended to address concerns voiced by some readers. And ABC 7 Chicago News did not respond. So are these isolated incidents, or do major media companies have a problem when it comes to reporting about race issues?
A reckoning is happening in the media. People are being forced to look themselves in the mirror and address the biases that exist in these newsrooms. I really feel like a sea change is coming.
Let's start with one of the most obvious issues here: diversity. In the US, one survey suggests around 77% of newsroom journalists are white, and around 23% are journalists from various racial and ethnic backgrounds. In the UK, that gap is even wider, with one report citing that white journalists make up around 94% of the industry.
Despite the strides and the efforts of African Americans to break into the media industry that has been going on since the 60s, when publications like the New York Times first started hiring black reporters to cover the civil rights movement, not much has really changed when it comes to the percentage of people of color in these newsrooms, let alone in leadership positions.
So when a newsroom isn't diverse, how do you authentically tell the stories of different communities? And as experts point out, there's more than one perspective to be had.
There are many different views within the black community, so woe betide any newsroom that thinks if they've got one black person in their newsroom, then that black person can speak for all black people, or that black person's perspective on the world reflects all black people's perspective on the world. It does not.
So when stories about the black community are covered in the news, what kind of stories are they, and how are black people portrayed?
The only time it seemed that black people appeared on screen was when there was a problem, a riot, or perhaps in some sporting capacity, or perhaps in some entertainment capacity. We were not real stakeholders. We were problems often to be observed.
Often the mainstream media, which is predominantly white, avoid some of our stories, to be, quite frank and honest. They tend to only get involved when something like a protest happens or when there's a huge incident like the death of George Floyd.
So the beginning started off as any report about black people starts off in negativity. He would take things in his stride. He knew how tall he was. He knew how big he was. He never wanted to intimidate. Why do you have to be intimidated by a black man that's tall? But I did see a change, and it was a change for the good. Protests on the street helped with that, right? But I wonder if is that because lots of white people were on the street too, so therefore they had to stop and listen? As a white media, did they have to stop and listen? Or did they actually think, no, there is truth here, and we need to get to the bottom of this truth?
But how is truth measured in journalism? Impartiality is the key word here, where journalists present the opposing views in an equal way. But experts say when there's evidence to suggest one side of the story can't be disputed, forcing balance isn't the answer.
The belief is that impartiality is truth, because you are giving both sides of the argument and you are allowing both sides to tell their truth. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't come with a heavy heart when you're trying to weigh up the truth on one side and the it doesn't matter whether they're not speaking the truth on the other, so long as I get their viewpoint. That's when being impartial to me fails, and it fails spectacularly.
The second part of impartiality is telling the story without favouring one side over the other. But some argue journalists, like anyone else, have opinions shaped by their own experience, which can lead to unconscious bias in their work.
The idea of this impartiality is rooted in America's white patriarchal mindset. Because what's considered to be impartial is the white male perspective. You know, Black reporters are often accused of being too close to the story. But what would a white person be like? They're also white. They have opinions about race. Journalists should be concerned about the truth. It should be about giving people information about what's actually happened, what is true. Impartiality, to me, is, a myth in journalism. Like, to me, it's impossible as long as we have a racist society.
What you read in the papers and watch on the news can play a really important part in how communities are portrayed and whether they make progress. So what needs to change? And how does the industry ensure every community's story is interpreted in a way that leaves them stronger?
There is so much positive about the Black race that never gets an airing, never gets to shine. And if only they could go in our homes and understand us and laugh with us and joke with us and see the spirit of us. Look at George Floyd, look at that story, look at the narrative, look at their family. If only they were doing that more, maybe we would have a better society because everyone would understand everyone more.
Newsrooms have to make the conscious decision that they are going to seriously address the issues of race in their newsroom, that they're going to actually give people of color a fair shot, consider them for the promotions, consider them for these roles, and not fall into the same trap of simply just looking in a mirror and trying to hire people who look like themselves.
It's a two-way process. Young people of color also have to want to be journalists. They have to see that the prospect of holding power to account is something that they want to do. And if you don't see people on screen doing it who look like you, it makes it perhaps less likely that you're going to stick your neck out.
We're not silent. We have a voice. We have an opinion. We want to speak on the truth. And we want people to know the truth of what's happening in America. And we can't do that without the press.